I wasn't in a good place that fall, and that's a plain sentence that still feels too small for what was happening inside me. I was 42, 20 years into wildland fire, and on mandatory leave after a burnover took Eli Madsen off my crew on a slope we had already mapped twice. Every report said the same thing in formal language: wind shift outside forecast window, fuel transition faster than modelled, entrapment conditions, no negligence found. I read those pages until the staples tore through the corners, and I believed them and didn't believe them at the same time. What followed me home wasn't accusation. Nobody at the station came at me that way. What followed me home was quieter than blame and heavier than anger. A hard, airless silence that settled in my chest and stayed there, day and night, like a hand pressing flat against my ribs. I started calling it the burnout quiet, because naming things is what firefighters do when we can't control them. Spot fire, slop over, reburn. We label and map and brief, because language gives shape to chaos. This one didn't care about labels. It turned sleep shallow. It made my own kitchen feel rented. It made every normal conversation feel like I was reading somebody else's lines off a damp card. My son, Caleb, was 15 then. He lived with his mum in town and came by every other weekend unless my schedule broke the arrangement, which it often had for years before that leave. He sat across from me at the table one Tuesday evening with a plate of reheated lasagna between us, and I could see him studying me the way you study a horse you don't know yet, calm on the outside, ready to move if needed. "You coming to my cross-country meet Saturday?" he asked. I took too long to answer. "I'm supposed to be out at the Creek parcel this week." He nodded once, trying to keep it easy. "Right, work stuff." "Not work, just fixing things." "Okay." We sat there with the fridge humming and the porch light buzzing with moths. He kept his eyes on his fork. I kept mine on the table grain where old heat rings had turned dark. I wanted to say I was sorry for every missed Saturday, every half-finished call, every time he learned not to expect me. What came out was, "How's your ankle?" "Fine," he said. "Coach taped it." "That's good." He gave me a little smile, kind but tired, and that hurt worse than if he'd gotten mad. Kids shouldn't need to be kind to their dads that way. When he left, he said, "Text me when you get up there." I said I would. I did not promise a meet I wasn't sure I could stand through without staring at the tree line and counting exits. 2 days later, my battalion chief, Nora Pike, stood in the apparatus bay with a clipboard she didn't need and told me what policy already had in writing. Her voice was level, practical, no pity mixed in, and I appreciated that more than she knew. 30 days minimum, she said. "You're cleared operationally. This is mandatory post-incident recovery. You know the language." I know the language. "Don't white-knuckle this, Hank." I let out a breath I hadn't noticed I was holding. What if white-knuckle is all I got right now? She looked at me for a long second, then hooked the clipboard under her arm. "Then borrow something else for a month. Go somewhere quiet. Stack wood. Fix fence. Come back with your edges not so sharp." That was the end of it. No speeches, no ceremony. Just me handing over my assignment packet and trying not to look at Engine 6 like it had picked a new driver while I was still standing there. The parcel above Black Alder Creek had come to me from my Uncle Ray, a retired Forest Service mechanic who believed in two things with a religious conviction: grease fittings and minding your own business. The deed was barely 15 acres, wedged between old federal access roads and private timber cuts, with an old pump shack, a hand-built shed, and a turnout where the Trailhead sign leaned 3 degrees off plumb, because Ray had set it by eye and never apologized for that. Years ago, before the divorce papers and overtime calendars turned life into logistics, I used to bring Caleb up there to fish the creek and cook sausage over a little steel grate. We'd sleep in the shed with the door cracked to hear water moving over stone. I hadn't spent a full night there in almost 6 years. I loaded my truck on a grey Thursday before sunup. Splitting maul, fencing pliers, 2 rolls of smooth wire, chainsaw, gas can, canvas tarp, food for 5 days, and Bristle's bed. Bristle was my retired fire dog, black and tan with a white blaze on his chest, and a scar under one ear from a barbed wire snag in his first season. Age had gone silver around his muzzle and stiffness into his hips, but he still had the map of me in his head. He watched my boots, watched my hands, and if I changed direction in my thinking, he seemed to catch it before I did. The drive out of town took 40 minutes if you didn't rush, and longer if logging trucks made you patient. By the time I turned onto the old spur road, the sky had lifted into that pale September blue that looks washed clean after smoke season, and the hills were patched in greens and browns, where summer heat had thinned everything out. The creek flashed between alders below the grade, cold and fast from an early shoulder season rain. I rolled down the window and got that smell I hadn't let myself miss. Wet duff, fir pitch, mineral water, old bark warming in first light. I told myself this was simple. Work list, motion, eat when hungry, sleep when tired, no heroics, no big thinking. If grief needed to show up, it could pick up a shovel first. The pump shack roof had dropped a little on the north side, same as I remembered. One fence run along the lower meadow had 3 posts leaning like old men after church. I parked beside the shed and stood there longer than necessary, keys in my hand, trying to recognize the man in that quiet place. Bristle hopped down slow, stretched, and made a low, contented grunt before nosing through grass, gone to seed. The first day was all practical labor. I reset 2 posts, tamped gravel around their bases, pulled slack from the wire, and replaced broken staples. I split a stack of lodgepole rounds Uncle Ray had left under a tarp that had long since surrendered to weather. I swept mouse droppings out of the shed, wiped down the camp stove, checked the old battery lantern, and ran a bead of sealant where the pump shack wall had opened at a knot. It should have felt good. Muscle memory should have settled me. Instead, each task landed and went flat, like dropping pebbles into wet ash. By late afternoon, a stillness moved in that didn't match the weather. Not storm quiet, not evening quiet. Just a broad hush that sat over the timberline and creek both. No jay chatter, no squirrel scolding. Even the little wind in the grass seemed to hold back. Bristle stopped halfway through his water, lifted his head, and turned toward the trees above the turnout. His ears went forward, then eased back. He wasn't alarmed. He was listening. Patiently, like he expected someone to finish crossing a room. "See something?" I asked him. His tail tapped once against the dirt. He kept watching. At dusk I lit the lantern, heated canned chili, and ate with a piece of bread that tasted mostly like salt and habit. Bristle curled near the door, nose on his paws. I sat with my back against the shed wall and looked at the helmet I had set on the bench beside my pack. Dented yellow shell, heat scuffs along the brim, soot staining the inner webbing where sweat had carried fine ash down my forehead all summer. I had worn that helmet in every major campaign for 9 years. I had trusted it like a second skull. That night, it looked like a relic from a church I no longer attended. Sleep came in short runs. I'd drift, then wake with my jaw clenched so hard my molars hurt. Once I sat straight up, sure I'd heard Eli call my name on the radio, clear as daylight, though the handheld was off and hanging from a nail. I stayed awake after that, listening to the creak and counting breaths, until first grey reached the door gap. By the second morning on the parcel, I had settled into a rough rhythm, the kind that keeps a man from sliding backward. Coffee before sunup, feed Bristle, check fence, split wood until shoulders warmed, then walk the upper edge where alder gave way to fir and old skid ruts held last week's rain. I found tracks all over the mud, normal enough for that country. Deer, raccoon, one young black bear that had wandered through sometime overnight. I noted them without thinking, same way I read wind in grass. Work brain still functioned, feeling brain kept skipping. Around noon I drove down to the county store for propane and a box of nails. Mrs. Ortega, who'd known me since I was a rookie, rang me up and said, "You look thin, Hank." "Camp food." She gave me that side eye only older women and squad bosses can do. "You eating enough isn't the same as you being okay." "I know." She slid the change toward me. "Your boy came in yesterday for sports drink, said you were up Creekside." He sounded proud of that. I pocketed the coins and nodded. "I'll text him tonight." "You do that." She softened her voice. "The mountains are good medicine if you let them be." "I'm trying." That evening I did text him, sent a picture of Bristle asleep with his paws in the air, and a line that said, "Fence repair is ugly but standing." Caleb replied with a laughing emoji and, "Nice work, old man." For 10 full seconds I smiled without forcing it. Then dark settled again, and with it, that same broad hush. Bristle lifted his head twice toward the timberline, ears tipped, relaxed but attentive, as if someone were moving out there with care not to disturb us. I stepped outside with my mug and stood under a sky so clear the stars looked hammered in. The whole ridge smelled of damp earth and cold cedar. I could hear Black Alder Creek talking over stone below, steady and ordinary. Everything else held still. I wasn't scared. That part matters. I had spent too many nights in fire camps and too many dawns on active lines to spook easy. What I felt was stranger than fear and harder to name. The sense that the land was occupied in a way I hadn't noticed before, not crowded, not hostile, just attentively inhabited. The burnout. Quiet inside me had gone so loud for months that I hadn't heard much else. Up there, with no engines, no briefings, no condolences, I started to hear beyond it. I turned in early and slept a little better. Not good, better. Sometime before dawn, rain ticked the shed roof, then passed. When I woke for real, Bristle was already sitting by the door, waiting on me with that old partner patience. I pulled on boots, shrugged into my canvas jacket, and reached for my helmet out of habit before stepping into the morning. The bench was empty. I checked under the cot, under the work table, in the truck cab, in the shed corner where old bait buckets were stacked. Nothing. Then I remembered setting it on the signpost stump at the Trailhead turnout last night, when I'd paused to tighten a loose bolt on the gate hinge, meaning to grab it on my way back, and walking off without it, because my mind was somewhere else entirely. I stood there in the chill doorway with rain smell still in the air and said, "Well, that's what I get." Then whistled for Bristle and started down the path toward the turnout. The path from the shed to the turnout wasn't long, maybe a quarter mile if you cut straight and didn't stop to look at anything. But that morning, it felt like one of those uphill stretches on a line where every step reminded you what your knees had already paid for. Rain had passed in the dark and left the ground slick under pine needles. Bristle moved ahead of me in short, careful trots, then checked back every few yards to make sure I was still following. He always did that when I got quiet for too long, like he'd decided years ago that part of his job was counting me. I kept telling myself it was only a helmet, a piece of gear I should have put away like a grown man instead of leaving it on a stump because my head was somewhere 3 months and 10 miles behind me. I had lost radios, gloves, one Pulaski once and found all of them eventually. But this one had weight that wasn't plastic and webbing. It was the shell Eli had seen on me every briefing, every mop-up, every ugly wind shift we ever talked through. If someone had stolen it, fine. If a bear had chewed it, fine. If a truck tire had flattened it into a yellow crescent, maybe that would have made practical sense too. There are objects you pretend are objects, and there are objects that carry your unfinished sentences. The trees along that stretch were mostly second-growth fir, tight-spaced, straight trunks with alder crowding the wetter side. Morning light came thin through the canopy, silver at first, then warming into a weak honey colour as the sun worked up behind the ridge. Water dripped from branch tips in patient intervals. The creek down below kept its own steady language, low and stony. My own breath sounded too loud in comparison. I was tired in that deep way that had nothing to do with sleep, and everything to do with holding shape for other people when you couldn't hold it for yourself. I thought about turning around once, maybe 50 yards from the turnout, and pretending I'd already checked. Buy another helmet in town. Tell nobody I'd been careless. Go back to splitting rounds and keep my eyes on work I could finish with my hands. That's the kind of bargain the burnout quiet liked to offer me. Smaller truth for smaller pain. I stood there with one boot on exposed root, one in mud, and listened to nothing but the creak and drops falling off cedar boughs. No thrush, no jay-racket, no squirrel chatter. Just that same broad hush from the night before, laid over everything like a blanket too heavy for the weather. Bristle stopped dead in the middle of the trail. His ears came forward, then relaxed. He didn't bristle up, didn't lift his lip, didn't give warning the way he would if a bear was close. He sat down slow, tail brushing wet needles once, and stared upslope into a stand of older timber where the understory went dark and open. I followed his line of sight and saw only trunks and shadow and fern. The hair on my forearms rose anyway, not from fear exactly, more from being noticed when you weren't expecting company. "You see someone?" I asked him quietly. He glanced back at me, then toward those trees again, almost polite about it, as if he didn't want to make a fuss. I took a step forward. He stood and fell in beside my left leg, shoulder touching my knee for 2 beats, before he moved ahead again. We kept walking. By the time we came out to the turnout, the sky had brightened enough to show every puddle and rut clear as map symbols. No fresh tire tracks besides mine from the day before. No candy wrappers, no beer cans, no shotgun shells, none of the little signs that said teenagers had used the place overnight. The old Trailhead sign still leaned 3 degrees off like Uncle Ray had left it, weathered plywood nailed to 2 posts sunk in stone. The stump beside it had a dark, wet ring where I remembered setting the helmet. For half a second, I didn't see it, and my chest tightened hard. Then I did. It sat square on top of the signpost stump like somebody had measured the center line and set it with both hands. Chin strap folded under the brim, neat as station inspection. And the brim, the whole dented yellow bowl of it, was filled to the edge with berries. Huckleberries mostly, deep purple-black with that dusty bloom still on them, and bright red thimbleberries soft as velvet tucked in around the sides so nothing spilled. Not smashed, not dirty, not handful thrown. Placed. I stopped a few feet away and just looked. The nearest decent huckleberry patch I knew was miles upslope past the old skid road and into colder ground that held moisture longer. Thimbleberries grew lower, but not in that turnout, and not this thick, this late, unless someone knew exactly where to look. These were fresh enough that a few still had tiny leaves clinging to their stems. Beads of water sat on them from the morning damp. One berry rolled to the rim and held there without falling. Bristle went straight to the stump, sniffed once, then sat beside it, and looked back at me with soft eyes, tail moving in a slow, content rhythm that did not match any alert pattern he'd ever used in his life. I scanned the tree line, the ditch, the road bend both ways. Nothing moved, The hush held. "Okay," I said to nobody I could see. My own voice sounded strange in that open space. "Okay, what is this?" Rational mind came online in steps, each one clean and useless. Neighbor kids pranking the firefighter on leave, except nobody around here hiked miles at dawn to stage fruit in old gear for a joke. A hiker finding my helmet and trying to be kind, except there were no prints in the mud but mine and the dog's. No boot tread pattern newer than last evening. Mrs. Ortega maybe, or Nora, driving up early and deciding I needed a nudge toward normal life. Except neither of them would fold a chin strap like that, and neither of them had reason to know I left the helmet there. Bear behavior didn't fit at all. Bear would knock, nose, scatter, maybe eat and move on. This was deliberate in a way that made my practical explanations feel thin. I crouched and looked close without touching anything. Berries were arranged almost level, heavier fruit at the bottom, lighter on top. A few stems were laid crosswise near the strap, like someone had paused, reconsidered, and made space. Mud on the stump showed one broad, shallow impression off to the side where weight had settled and lifted without digging in. Not a boot edge, not a hoof, not clear enough to call anything, but big and careful. The bark on a young fir behind the sign had been bent outward at shoulder height, not snapped, just guided aside and released so it sprang back with a smooth arc. My throat tightened for a reason I couldn't fully explain. I had been moving through days like a machine set to minimum function, and this stupid, generous, unasked-for bowl of berries in a battered helmet broke through that numbness cleaner than any counseling pamphlet or formal check-in I'd sat through. I stood up, took one breath, and heard myself say, out loud, "Well, thank you, I guess." Then I laughed once, short and surprised, because there I was, 42 years old, thanking empty trees like I'd gone gently off my rails. Bristle huffed and wagged harder, and I laughed again, softer this time. The sound didn't echo. It just settled. I carried the helmet back with both hands like it was full of water I didn't want to spill. Bristle stayed close on my right, occasionally stretching his neck to sniff the rim, and then looking up slope again, never tense, never hurried. Halfway down the trail, I stopped at a flat rock where we usually paused and set the helmet there to catch my breath. Light had finally reached the upper branches, turning wet needles bright and gold at the tips, while the ground stayed cool and shadowed. Somewhere higher up, a branch shifted with the gentle scrape of wood on wood, the sound of something large moving slowly through tight growth and taking care where it placed weight. Then, stillness returned. I didn't call out. I didn't run. I just waited a few seconds, then picked up the helmet and finished the walk. Back at the shed, I set the berries on the work table and sorted them with a coffee mug and my old mess tin. Good fruit in one, leaves and stray stems in another. Bristle got 2 huckleberries and looked offended there weren't 10 more. I ate one myself, then another, tart and sweet and cold from morning air. And for the first time in months, food tasted like itself instead of obligation. I rinsed the tin, lit the camp stove, and made oatmeal with the rest of the berries folded in at the end. Steam rose in thin curls, carrying that wild fruit smell that reminded me of late-season breakfasts with Caleb when he was little and would stain his fingers purple before the pan was even hot. I sat on the shed step with the bowl in my hands and watched sunlight move across the fence line I'd repaired. The burnout quiet was still there, still heavy in places, but it had a seam in it now, a narrow opening where curiosity had slipped in. Who noticed a forgotten helmet and brought it back cleaner than I'd left it? Who walked miles for fruit and set it down like an offering instead of a prank? Why did Bristle act like he was in the company of an old, trusted hand? By late morning, clouds had burned off, and the day settled into clear blue. I went back to work because that was what I knew how to do. I reset another post, sharpened the splitting maul, and patched a loose hinge on the pump shack door. But every hour or so I'd glance toward the turnout trail without meaning to, listening for that same soft shift in the timber. Once, around noon, Bristle lifted his head from his bed, stared toward the tree line for a full minute, then laid his chin back down with a deep, satisfied sigh, as if someone had passed by and he approved. I told myself this couldn't be real in the way my brain was framing it. I told myself grief makes patterns where there are none, that tired men anthropomorphize weather and dogs and random luck. Those were fair arguments. They were the arguments of a man trained to doubt what he couldn't verify. Yet that helmet sat on my bench with berry stains along the inner rim, and rainwater still beaded on fruit that did not grow anywhere near that turnout. The evidence didn't ask me to believe. It asked me to pay attention. By the time the light started leaning west, I had washed the helmet except for the stains where juice had darkened the webbing and set it brim up on the bench to dry. I meant to scrub it clean later. I didn't. Something in me wanted that mark to stay. Proof that kindness had found me when I hadn't done a thing to earn it except forget what I was carrying. I left the helmet on the bench until the last light thinned out and the shed wall turned the color of old iron. The berry stains along the webbing had gone from purple to a muted rust, and I stood there with a rag in my hand, deciding whether to scrub harder, when Bristle got up from his bed and faced the turnout trail again. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just watched, ears tipped forward, breathing steady like he was waiting for someone to come around a corner. I set the rag down. There was a smooth creek stone on the shelf by the door, fist-sized, grey with a white quartz seam through the middle. Caleb had picked it years ago because he said it looked like a lightning bolt trapped in rock. I'd kept it for no reason beyond not throwing things away. I picked it up, walked to the turnout, and set it in the middle of the same stump where I'd found the helmet. "Trade offer," I said quietly, then shook my head at myself. "Listen to me." That was the first time in months I'd caught myself sounding foolish and didn't hate it. I stood there another minute in the evening cool, hands in my jacket pockets, feeling like a man trying to follow social rules for a world he had never expected to enter. Then I went back, shut the shed door, and slept in fits that were still rough, but no longer combative. By the fourth morning on the parcel, I had added one new task to my work list, without admitting that's what I was doing. Coffee, feed Bristle, fence line, woodpile, check the stump. I kept calling it a check, like I was inspecting culverts. Bristle called it something else with his body. He moved faster on that stretch, then slowed near the turnout and looked at me before he looked at the stump, like we were arriving at someone's porch. The stone was gone. In its place, 2 alder twigs were laid in a clean X. Bark peeled in a narrow spiral along each stem as neat as if a pocket knife had done it. Beside them sat 3 chanterelles on a flat piece of bark, caps dry and clean, stems trimmed short. Not yanked, cut or snapped with care. Chanterelles didn't grow in that gravel turnout either. They came from shaded duff higher up, where the soil stayed cool. I crouched and studied the ground. The rain had softened the top layer of mud by the ditch, and there were impressions there too broad for my handspan. Shallow at the heel, deeper at the forefoot, evenly spaced. The stride length suggested size. The pressure suggested restraint. A heavy animal usually punched holes in wet ground. Whatever had stepped there distributed weight like somebody carrying a full bucket they didn't want to spill. I looked over at Bristle. "You seeing this?" He sniffed one chanterelle, sneezed once, and sat. Tail tap. Calm eyes. no tension in him anywhere. I took the mushrooms back to camp in my mess tin and cooked them with butter and a pinch of salt for lunch. I ate slowly, trying to keep one foot in practicality. Could be a person. Could be somebody from an old logging road walking through before dawn. Could be a hunter with a sense of humor and excellent forest knowledge. Could be my own attention-changing shape because grief had bored holes in me, and now anything gentle poured straight through. Every explanation I laid out had one problem. The details kept arriving with a precision that felt relational, not random. That afternoon I split wood until my palms stung, then sat on the step and watched sunlight move through alder leaves. I thought about Eli for the first time in weeks without replaying the burn-over timeline second by second. I remembered him in a station kitchen balancing a paper plate on one hand and arguing that canned peaches belonged in chili if the shift had gone long enough. I remembered him practicing radio discipline in a voice so formal we all laughed. It hurt. It also felt clean, like opening a window in a room that had stayed shut too long. Near dusk, I cut a 6-inch strip of red survey tape from my toolbox and tied it loose around the turnout post. Not simple enough to undo without tearing. I had no logic for that one except wanting to see if this quiet conversation could continue in terms a practical man could track. I slept a little deeper that night, and when I woke before dawn, Bristle was still snoring, paws twitching against his bed like he was running in some good dream. The tape was gone in the morning. My left work glove, which I'd lost the day before between woodpile and pump shack, was laid palm up on the dry board beside the stove vent where heat from the flue kept rain off. A second strip of red tape had been looped around the glove cuff in a tidy bow that somehow looked both clumsy and deliberate, like big hands copying a small gesture from memory. I laughed under my breath and said, "You have got to be kidding me." Not fear, not panic, just a kind of stunned gratitude that made me feel younger and older at the same time. I slipped the glove on, worked my fingers into place, and noticed the leather had been turned to face the heat just enough to dry, not enough to stiffen. Whoever had done it understood wet gear and the difference between helping and ruining. 3 days passed with that pattern settling in. I'd leave something simple and harmless. I'd find something returned with thought behind it. A polished stone for a feather laid across my sore buck. Half a biscuit bristle refused for a line of late-season blackberries on the gate rail. An old brass washer from Uncle Ray's coffee tin for a small forked stick set upright in the mud, pointing toward a safer crossing where the bank had slumped after rain. The world around the parcel stayed in post-season quiet, but it no longer felt empty. It felt inhabited by a patient intelligence that preferred edges and intervals. I tried one more reasoning cycle because that was who I'd always been. I walked the perimeter and looked for human signs: cigarette butts, cut boot tread, nylon snag on brush, fresh saw marks, any indication of campfire ash where it shouldn't be. Nothing. I checked game trails for bear scat and claw marks. Found some older sign, none near the gifts. I stood in the turnout and timed the walk to the closest neighbor parcel and back. Too long for casual dawn visits, especially carrying berries from upslope. I even considered whether someone had accessed by ATV from the upper cut. No new tire ruts, no engine sound at night, no smell of gas or hot metal in the morning stillness. By the second week of October, I had started ending each workday at the logged opening above the old skid road, where the fir stand broke into a broad slope of grass, brush, and silver stumps weathered smooth at the tops. It gave a view across 2 shallow draws and the first wall of timber beyond. Good place for evening light. Good place to see movement if movement wanted to be seen. That evening the sky went honey gold under a band of high cloud, and every grass head on the slope caught light, like wire. Bristle sat beside me without leaning, just close enough that our shoulders almost touched. The temperature had dropped a few degrees from the afternoon, and I could smell damp earth rising where shade had already taken the low ground. A flicker hammered somewhere to the north, then went quiet. No wind, no engines, no human sound at all. I had a thermos cup in my hand and 1,000 old habits telling me to scan for hazard, identify routes, classify what I saw. Then, at the far timber edge, something moved behind a fir trunk and did not fit any category my brain offered first. It was tall in a way that broke scale, not because I could measure it yet, but because the trunk beside it gave reference, and my eyes kept insisting I had it wrong. Dark fur caught amber along one side where the low sun hit through branches, shoulders broad enough to block the gap between two saplings. It stepped forward and paused, then reached with one arm to move a young fir out of its path, fingers closing around the stem and guiding it aside rather than snapping through. The sapling bent, held, then slid free and stood back up, trembling. I felt every muscle along my back lock and then ease, all in one breath. I told myself this couldn't be real. I heard in my own head, plain as if spoken. I told myself I was tired, and tired men misread distance. But Bristle stayed seated, tail thumping once against the dirt. He looked from me to the figure and back again with soft eyes, the same look he gave old captains he trusted in briefing rooms. The figure took 2 more steps into a stripe of light and stopped completely. 8 feet at least, maybe more. Long arms, barrel chest. The movement had none of the jerky uncertainty of an animal surprised by people. It had the measured pace of someone deciding where to place each foot so the ground and whoever watched would stay untroubled. My throat went dry. Not from terror, from the sheer non-trivial fact of it. I set the cup down slowly and kept my hands where they could be seen, palms open like I was approaching a nervous horse. The distance between us was maybe 80 yards across brush and old slash, close enough to feel present, far enough to stay safe for both of us. The creature turned its head slightly in my direction. I saw the face in partial profile then, heavy brow, dark muzzle line, eyes catching light, brown amber for a second before shadow took them again. I wanted to run. I wanted to walk closer. I did neither. I stayed where I was and breathed. "My name's Hank," I said, barely above a whisper. "Hank West." The figure dipped its head once, small and deliberate, a motion that read like acknowledgement, more than uncertainty. Then it lowered one hand toward a stump at the edge of the clearing, opened its fingers, and left a cluster of late blackberries there, dark and shining in the last light. It stepped back 2 paces into the timber, not hurried, not evasive, just giving distance back to me as if distance itself were a courtesy. I stood there with tears in my eyes before I understood they were there. No dramatic reason, no single thought, just the release of being met by something vast that did not ask anything from me except honesty. Bristle rose, stretched, and gave a low, pleased huff. We waited another minute. The trees held still. The figure was gone, swallowed by trunks and dusk so quietly the forest seemed to close around the space it had occupied. I walked to the stump on unsteady legs and found the blackberries set in a little crescent, stems turned inward, no crushed fruit beneath. I did not eat them there. I lifted them carefully in both hands and carried them back down the trail with Bristle trotting ahead, checking on me every few yards like he already knew I was walking home as a different man than the one who had climbed up. By the time I reached the shed, dusk had thinned down to that narrow blue hour when the trees go flat at the edges, and every sound carries farther than it should. I set the blackberries on the table beside the stove, washed my hands without looking up, then stood there with water running over my fingers long after they were clean. Bristle drank, circled twice, and lay down by the door, but he kept lifting his head to look at me as if checking whether I was still in one piece. I was, technically. Inside, I felt like a map someone had redrawn while I was out walking. I lit the lantern, even though there was still enough light to see, more from habit than need, and sat on the step with the berries in my palms. They were colder now, and a few had leaked dark juice across my skin. I could still picture the way that huge hand had opened over the stump, how careful it had been with something soft. The scale of it and the restraint of it didn't fit in the same mental drawer. I had seen big men panic horses by moving wrong. I had seen experienced sawyers wreck a whole face cut by forcing 1 second too fast. Whatever I had met up there had moved with control. I associated with old captains and good medics, people who understood that calm was a tool. I ate 3 berries. Bristle got 2. He accepted that bargain with long-suffering dignity, then laid his chin on my knee. I told myself this still had to reduce to something ordinary. A person in a ghillie suit with unusual proportions, a trick of evening light, stress response plus isolation plus grief, turning distant shapes into narratives. I could build that case. I tried to build it hard enough to stand in. Then I would hit one detail, and the scaffolding fell apart again. The guided sapling, not broken, the head dip when I said my name, the way it had stepped back to preserve space for me, like we were 2 men at opposite sides of a gate, deciding not to crowd each other. I sat there listening to the creak and ran my thumb along the helmet's dented rim until I found the notch where Eli had once dropped it on basalt, and laughed that my gear had more miles than a county truck. That memory landed without knocking me sideways. It just landed. I took that as a small mercy. When full dark finally settled, I left 6 blackberries on the stump at the turnout and came back with the empty tin in my hand, feeling equal parts foolish and sincere. I'd spent my adult life around radios, weather windows, and hard evidence. Now, I was plating fruit for a neighbor I couldn't explain. If somebody from the station had seen me, I'd never hear the end of it. The thought made me smile for a second, and that startled me almost as much as the clearing had. That night, sleep came in longer stretches. I still woke once with my jaw tight, pulse running ahead of reason, but I didn't hear phantom radio traffic, and I didn't bolt upright looking for flame. I listened. A few drops moved through cedar needles after midnight. Once, maybe an hour before dawn, I heard soft steps outside the shed wall, too measured for deer, too quiet for bear. Then a gentle tap against wood as if something had set weight down and removed it. I stayed still under my blanket, every sense awake. Bristle raised his head, thumped his tail twice against the floorboards, and settled again without a sound. I whispered into the dark, "You're all right to be here." No answer came, and I hadn't expected one. Still, the silence that followed felt companionable instead of empty, which was new enough to keep me awake for a while just noticing it. Morning broke clear and cold, bright enough to put a hard shine on the pump shack roof. When I stepped outside with coffee, there was a small pile of split kindling stacked by the door in a pattern I didn't use, alternating crosswise layers no wider than my forearm. Dry cedar slivers on top, thicker fur beneath, all bark turned down to shed dew. Beside it sat my old can opener. I had lost 2 days earlier near the wash basin. I laughed out loud, a real one this time. "All right," I said to the tree line. "You're showing off now." Bristle trotted to the kindling, sniffed, then sat back and looked upslope with those same soft eyes he'd had in the clearing. If dogs could shrug, that was his whole posture. Of course he's here. Catch up, Hank. By Monday morning, I had stopped pretending these exchanges were random accidents and started treating them like what they were: communication by object, distance, and patience. I left a polished horseshoe nail on the stump, something from Uncle Ray's coffee can that felt like a practical thank you. I found it that afternoon laid beside a spray of yarrow and a single smooth antler tine, both positioned so neat they could have been part of a ranger display. No footprints near the stump this time, only a broad, flattened patch in the grass, 10 feet back where something heavy had paused and watched. That evening, I drove down to the county store for dog food and lamp oil. Mrs. Ortega rang me up and peered over my shoulder toward the truck bed. "You've been smiling more," she said. "Have I?" "You have." She handed me the receipt. "Either the fence is finally behaving, or you met better company than your own thoughts." I hesitated, then went with the safer truth. "Bristle's been doing good up there, better than in town." She nodded like that told her enough. Dogs know where peace lives. We pretend we're smarter. On impulse, I texted Caleb from the parking lot. "Got fresh berries again. You and I should do pancakes up here when you're free." He answered in under a minute. "I'm in. Saturday after practice?" For once, I didn't stare at the message wondering how I'd mess it up. I just typed, "Saturday works," and meant it. Back at camp, the temperature dropped fast once the sun cleared the ridge. I fed Bristle, tightened the lantern wick, and walked the lower fence run with a coil of wire and fencing pliers to deal with a sag near the creek bend. That section had always been trouble. Alder roots lifted posts. Spring runoff undercut the bank. Uncle Ray used to call it the arguing corner, because no repair held for long without another repair behind it. I was halfway through restapling a strand when Bristle moved ahead into tall grass and gave a short, sharp yelp I had heard only a few times in his life. Not panic, pain. Every part of me snapped into motion. I dropped pliers and ran toward the sound, boots sliding in wet thatch. 20 yards down, the grass opened into a shallow dip where old woven wire from a long-dead interior fence lay hidden under leaves. Bristle stood three-legged, front paw caught in a rusted loop twisted up like a snare. He wasn't thrashing yet, but he was tense and breathing fast, trying to hold still because he knew I was coming. Then I saw I wasn't first. The creature was already there, crouched on one knee in the grass, huge back to me, body angled sideways so it did not block Bristle's line of sight to the open meadow. One hand steadied the wire against the ground. The other worked the loop with slow, precise turns, thick fingers pinching and easing corroded metal apart a fraction at a time. Bristle's ears were forward. No growl, no fear, just trust and discomfort and waiting. I stopped at the edge of the dip, chest heaving, and raised both hands so I looked as harmless as a man in work boots can look. "It's okay," I said to both of them. "I'm here. You're okay, buddy." The creature turned its head enough for one amber-brown eye to catch me, then looked back to Bristle's paw and kept working. There was a softness in that decision that broke me open all over again. It didn't guard the dog from me. It didn't retreat and leave the hard part undone. It finished the task. Metal gave with a dry little pop. The loop opened. Bristle pulled free and stepped back, favoring the paw but upright. He leaned forward immediately and pressed his muzzle once to the creature's wrist, brief and matter-of-fact, like thanking a medic after stitches. The creature held still, then touched 2 fingers lightly to the top of Bristle's head and withdrew its hand. I don't know how long we stayed in that triangle of silence. Seconds, probably. It felt slower than that. "I appreciate you," I said, voice rough. "I mean that." The creature shifted weight, rose to full height in one unhurried motion, and stepped backward twice, so it stood clear of both of us. Up close, the size was hard to pass against anything except feeling. The shoulders were as wide as my truck hood, fur dark as wet bark with sun-brown tips along the forearms, face broad, watchful and calm. Not tame, not wild in any way, I understood. Present. I knelt by Bristle and checked his paw. Red pressure mark, no cut, no puncture. Lucky. I rubbed the joint gently. He flinched, then licked my sleeve and leaned against me as if to say, "Keep moving, we're fine." I picked up the rusted wire loop and coiled it tight so it couldn't catch anything else, then set it in my back pocket. When I looked up, the creature had moved 3 paces farther upslope and paused beside a fallen cedar. It bent, gathered a double armful of dry branches stacked under the log where rain hadn't reached, carried them down, and laid them by my dropped tool bag. Then it placed the pliers on top of the bundle with careful fingertips, arranging them so the handles faced me. Deliberate, unmistakable, aimed right at what I needed in that exact moment. Dog safe, hazard removed, firewood dry, tools returned. I felt tears push up again and didn't fight them. "Thank you," I said, "for him, for all of it." The creature dipped its head once, the same restrained acknowledgement as before, then turned and moved into the firs above the creek bend. Branches parted and settled behind it with barely a shake. No crashing retreat. No drama. Just departure. Bristle watched until the last motion disappeared, then sneezed, shook himself, and nosed my hand for a treat I didn't have. I laughed through the wet in my eyes and scratched behind his scarred ear. "Yeah," I told him, standing with one hand on his collar while he tested his weight. "You trusted him first. That probably should have told me something." We walked back to the shed slower than usual, Bristle limping for the first 100 yards, then easing into a normal gait. I carried the branch bundle under one arm and the coiled snare wire in my jacket pocket, like evidence I didn't need to submit to anyone but myself. At the door, I dropped the wire into the scrap bucket, fed Bristle early, and built a small fire from the cedar branches that caught on the first match and burned clean. As evening settled, I sat on the step with my coffee and watched mist collect over Black Alder Creek. The burnout quiet was still in me, but it no longer owned every room. Wonder had moved in beside it and started opening windows. I sat there until the coffee went cool in my cup, and the fire dropped from flame to red seams in the cedar. Mist kept lifting off Black Alder Creek in pale strips, drifting through the lower alders and catching on fence wire like wool. Bristle had settled by my boot, breathing deep and even, one front paw stretched toward the coals, as if he knew exactly how close to comfort a body ought to rest. When the cold started to press through my jacket, I stood and carried the scrap bucket into the shed. The rusted wire loop from the grass dip was still in my pocket, sharp where it had twisted and work-hardened over years of weather. I dropped it in with a handful of bent staples and old nails, then stopped and pulled it back out again. I did not want that piece buried under clutter, waiting to snag something else in 10 years. I found an empty coffee can, wrote hazard wire on the side with a grease pencil, coiled the loop tight and set it inside. Then I walked the shed perimeter with the lantern and found 2 more lengths of abandoned woven wire under leaves near the back wall, both half hidden and mean. I rolled those too, cussed once when a barb caught my glove, and packed them in the same can. It was practical work. It was also something else. I had spent months replaying one afternoon I could not repair. Now I was fixing what sat in reach. By full dark, the stars were out again, hard and bright over the ridge, and the whole parcel smelled like wet dirt cooling fast. I fed Bristle, checked his paw one more time, still only a pressure mark, no swelling, and gave him his old blanket by the stove. He sighed like an old man and dropped onto it with complete trust in the world. I didn't have that trust yet. I had something closer to willingness. I set the helmet on the table, turned it in my hands, and ran my thumb along the inside webbing where berry stains had set permanent. Under the lantern glow, I could still see a line of soot along one strap from the Madsen Creek campaign 2 summers back. Eli had teased me about never replacing gear until it was one strap from retirement. He'd said it with a grin and an armful of hose, already walking uphill before I answered him. I sat on the stool and let that memory stay. Then another came, and another, not as a chain of failures, but as pieces of a life that had held laughter and boredom, and cheap station coffee and arguments about weather models, and songs nobody admitted they liked. My chest tightened. I leaned forward with both elbows on my knees and tried the old method. Steady breathing. Count to 4. Focus on an object. Name 5 things I could touch. Table edge, canvas sleeve, dog fur, lantern handle, helmet brim. It worked on panic. This wasn't panic. This was grief finally finding a door. I put both hands over my face and cried into my palms. Not loud, not dramatic, just tired tears that kept coming when I gave up stopping them. Bristle lifted his head, watched me for a second, then stood and pressed his shoulder into my shin until I moved one hand to his neck. He stayed there, warm and solid, and that steadiness let me keep going. "I'm sorry," I said to the empty room, voice rough. "I'm sorry, Eli. I'm sorry I keep carrying you like a report I failed instead of a person I miss." The lantern hissed softly. Fire shifted in the stove. Outside, creek water moved over stone in the dark. I kept talking because silence had been strangling me for months, and words were finally moving again. "I've been making your death the only thing about you. That isn't right. You were a whole kid with dumb jokes and too much hot sauce, and that beat-up guitar in your truck. You were not a line item." I swallowed and wiped my face with my sleeve. I know what the board said. I know what happened on that slope. I also know I came home and locked myself in this frozen place because if I stayed numb, I thought that counted as respect. Bristle gave a low groan and leaned harder into my leg, like he was holding me upright by effort alone. "I don't want to live there anymore," I said, quieter now. "I don't think that honors anybody." I stayed on that stool a long time, speaking in starts and pauses, telling the air things I had not told Nora, not told Caleb, not told myself, in full sentences. I said Eli's name enough times that it stopped feeling like touching a live wire. I said my own name once too, just to hear that I was still here. An hour later, when my breathing had settled and the stove was down to coals, I took out my phone and stared at Caleb's thread. It was late, but not too late. I hit call before I could reconsider. He answered on the 4th ring, voice sleepy but clear. "Dad?" "Hey, bud. Sorry if I woke you." "No, I was up. You okay?" I looked at the helmet, then at Bristle, then at my hands. "Yeah. I mean, more okay than I've been. I wanted to ask if Saturday's still good for pancakes." "Yeah, for sure. Mum can drop me at the turnout after practice." "Good. Bring that cast iron spatula you like." He laughed softly. "The one you say is too heavy?" "It is too heavy. You're still bringing it." A pause, then he said, "You sound different." I didn't dodge it. "I think I am different tonight." "Different good? Different honest." I cleared my throat. "I've missed a lot, Caleb. I know that." Another pause, longer, but not brittle. "Then come Saturday. We'll start there." "We'll start there," I said. After we hung up, I stood in the doorway and listened to the ridge. The hush was still out there, broad and attentive, but it didn't feel airless. It felt like being witnessed without being cornered. I took the helmet and set it on the turnout stump again, empty this time, chin strap folded like before. Next to it, I placed a single item from my pocket. Eli's old radio channel marker, a little red plastic tab with a worn number 2 printed on it. I had carried it for months like a talisman and a burden both. I rested it inside the helmet brim and stepped back. "That's me trying," I said to the trees, "not forgetting, just trying." No movement answered. I didn't need one. I went back to the shed, banked the stove, and slept deeper than I had since summer. Some time before dawn, Bristle's tail thumped once against the floorboards and woke me. No bark, no alarm. Just that one measured beat. I lay still under the blanket and listened. There were steps outside, slow and heavy but careful on the gravel, then a faint wooden tap near the porch rail. Then silence. A minute later came another sound from the turnout direction, the soft scrape of something set down on old stump wood. I could have gotten up and rushed out there with the lantern. I did not. I stayed in the dark and let the moment happen at its own pace. By the time first grey touched the door gap, the sounds were gone. I pulled on boots, wrapped in my jacket, and stepped into a morning cold enough to smoke my breath. The sky was pearl-coloured over the ridge, and frost rimed the grass along the fence. Bristle trotted ahead with an easy gait, paw moving clean, and paused at the turnout to look back at me as if to say, "Take your time." The helmet sat where I had left it, but not empty. Inside was a neat bed of dry cedar bark strips, tinder fungus, and pencil-thin twigs snapped to even length. On top lay my red channel marker, clean and scented, with a spray of yarrow tucked beside it, and 3 blackberries, dark against the yellow shell. Not a pile this time, just 3. I stood there with both hands in my pockets and let that composition speak in the plain language it had been teaching me all along. Keep what matters. Carry only what lights. Leave room for warmth. Off to the side, in the frost-soft mud near the ditch, broad tracks crossed the turnout in an arc that kept respectful distance from where I stood. The impressions were deep at toe, light at heel, and each step landed in open ground between stones as if avoiding noise. The trail of them led upslope toward older fir and faded where needles thickened. "Thank you," I said, voice low. "For the dog, for the wood, for this." Bristle sat beside my knee, tail brushing my boot once, then watched the timberline with that same untroubled attention. We took the helmet back to the shed and laid the tinder by the stove. The yarrow went in a jar with creek water on the windowsill. I set the channel marker on the shelf over my bedroll instead of returning it to my pocket. Then I made breakfast, real breakfast, with eggs and the last of the potatoes, and ate all of it while steam clouded the window. By mid-morning, I loaded the hazard wire can into the truck bed so I'd take it to county disposal the next supply run. I did not want hidden snares on my ground again. I checked the lower fence, tightened one staple and stopped twice, just to look up at the fir line without urgency. Around noon, clouds rolled in from the west, thin and high, silvering the light. The parcel settled into its post-season quiet, creak steady, alder leaves ticking in a faint breeze. I walked to the edge of the logged opening once more, hands empty, Bristle ranging a few yards ahead and circling back. I did not see him there. I did not hear movement beyond a raven passing overhead. The distance where we had stood held only grass, old stumps and shade beneath the firs. I waited anyway, not because I expected a show, but because waiting had become part of the exchange. After a while, I understood the next part too. Kindness had already happened. It did not need repeating on demand. Whatever lived in that timber moved by its own ethics, not my need, and one of those ethics was leaving gently. So I touched 2 fingers to the brim of my cap toward the tree line, turned back toward the shed, and went on with the day, while the creature withdrew into the woods without ceremony, without claim, and with the same patient courtesy it had shown from the beginning. I got back to the shed and did what I always did when I didn't trust my feelings yet. I put my hands on tasks. I split the remaining cedar bark into 2 bundles, one for the stove shelf and one for a dry tin by the door. I wrapped the 3 blackberries in wax paper and set them beside the eggs, not as food, just as a marker. Then I took the helmet, still smelling faintly of smoke and wild fruit, and placed it on the top shelf where Uncle Ray used to keep carburetor parts he didn't want touched. Bristle watched me from his blanket, head on paws, eyes open like he approved of that decision. The next morning I loaded the truck at first light. The coffee can labelled hazard wire went in first, then the scrap bucket with the extra staples, then my old field notebook. I paused with the notebook in my hand and opened to a clean page. I wrote down every odd detail I had flagged over the past week in plain block letters. Broad, shallow tracks, stride even, no gouging in mud, branches bent, not torn, gifts placed dry, scented and orderly, wildlife quiet but not alarmed, dog calm in all encounters. I wasn't trying to prove anything to anybody. I needed a record that respected what happened instead of sanding it down into something easier. By the 3rd week of October, frost held in the ditches until noon, and the county transfer station smelled like wet cardboard and diesel. I carried the coffee can to the metal disposal bin myself, popped the lid, and tipped out every coil of rusted wire. They slid in with a brittle clatter. A guy in an orange vest looked over and said, "Old fence clean-up?" "Yeah," I said. "Hidden stuff. Caught my dog." He nodded, serious now. "Good on you for pulling it." I kept the empty can. I washed it at the spigot and set it back in my truck because the label mattered to me. Hazard identified, hazard removed. Not dramatic, just finished. From there, I drove to Mrs. Ortega's store for propane and dog food. She rang me up, then rested both hands on the counter and gave me the same long look she'd given me years earlier when I came in with smoke still in my hair and tried to act like I wasn't exhausted. "You're carrying yourself different," she said. "I slept," I answered. "For real." "That place up the creek helping?" "It is." She tilted her head toward the mountains, visible through the front window. "My father used to say those ridges had old neighbors. Said if they ever helped you, you thanked them by being kinder in town than you were before. He never made a speech about it. Just did extra for people when hunting season came around." I stood there with my wallet in my hand, feeling the floor hum under the refrigerator units. "Did he ever tell you what he saw?" She gave a small smile and shook her head. "No, and I never asked twice. Some things are private without being secret." That was the closest anyone ever came to confirming what I knew. She never brought it up again. She didn't need to. Saturday morning came clear and cold, and I was at the turnout half an hour early with a folding table, camp stove, and Caleb's 2 heavy cast-iron pan waiting on a clean towel. Bristle paced circles until he heard Nora's old sedan climbing the spur. She pulled in, rolled down the window, and gave me a look that mixed command and concern the way only a battalion chief can. "You good to have him overnight?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She studied my face for a beat. "You look more like yourself, West." "Not the same self," I said, "but better company." She let out a breath that might have been relief. "I'll take that." Caleb hopped out with his backpack and a bag of flour under one arm. "Mum says don't let him burn the pancakes." Nora snorted. "Your dad can run a saw line in crosswinds. He can handle breakfast." Then she looked back at me, softer. "Call me Monday. We'll talk assignment options." "I will." When she drove off, Caleb and I stood in the turnout listening to gravel settle. He looked at the stump, then at the helmet on my truck hood. "Is that berry stain?" he asked. "Yeah." He touched the rim gently, like it was something historical. "You keeping it?" "On a shelf, not for work anymore." He nodded like he understood more than I had explained, then clapped his hands once. "Okay, pancakes." We cooked in the open while mist lifted off the creek. He handled batter. I handled heat. Bristle supervised for dropped scraps with full professional commitment. We talked about his cross-country times, the math test he hated, the way his left knee clicked on steep descents. Halfway through the second batch, he flipped one clean and said, "You're not drifting off mid-conversation now." I looked at him over the pan. "I know. It used to feel like you were here and not here." He kept his eyes on the pancake, voice steady. "I got used to it, didn't like it, got used to it." The truth of that landed heavy and fair. "I'm sorry," I said. "I can't get those years back. I can show up for the next ones." He slid the pancake to a plate and finally met my eyes. "Then keep doing this. Saturdays, even if it rains. Even if it rains." After breakfast, we walked the old path together. At the logged opening, he stood quiet for a while, hands in his jacket pockets, then said, "This place feels, I don't know, bigger than it looks." "That's exactly it," I said. He didn't ask for more, and I didn't force it. On the way back, he pointed out a line of mushrooms near a stump and made me kneel so he could photograph them for science class credibility, as he put it. I laughed hard enough Bristle looked offended we had paused without offering him food. 3 days later, I sat across from Nora in her station office with the whiteboard maps behind her and the smell of wet Nomex drifting in from the bay. She had my leave paperwork on one side and a yellow legal pad on the other. "You called," she said. "That tells me a lot." "I'm ready to come back," I said, "but not in the same slot. I want training. New recruits, refreshers, entrapment drills, communication discipline. I can do that without pretending I'm fine when I'm not." She leaned back, arms crossed. "That's a non-trivial ask in staffing season." "I know." She held my gaze, then nodded once. "It's also the right ask. We can move you to training and safety for winter block and reassess in spring." I felt my shoulders drop an inch. "Thank you." She tapped the legal pad with her pen. "One more thing, that month up the creek. You come back with any incident I need on paper? Trespassers, wildlife conflict, infrastructure damage?" This was the crux. Report what I could document. Protect what I couldn't explain without handing it to jokes or opportunists. I chose precision. Found and removed abandoned snare wire. Repaired lower fence hazard. No conflict events. Parcel is stable. She watched me for a long second, same loaded look from the bay weeks earlier, then wrote exactly what I said. "Copy that," she replied. "Stable works." By the first hard freeze in November, my routine had changed shape in ways I could feel in my bones. I taught rookie classes in the mornings, watched them practice shelter deployments on frosted grass, and corrected radio phrasing until they rolled their eyes and got it right anyway. On Wednesdays, I still drove to Black Alder after shift, with Bristle in the passenger seat. I swept the shed, checked the fence line, and sat at dusk near the turnout without asking for anything. Sometimes the woods were only woods. Sometimes I found a crossed pair of twigs on the stump or a feather laid beside a stone. I stopped treating those signs as evidence and started treating them as reminders. I accounted for every object tied to that season because that mattered to me. The hazard wire stayed disposed. The empty labelled can held clean fencing staples now, a practical replacement for a solved problem. The yarrow from the helmet dried on the windowsill, then I pressed it in my notebook beside the page of observations. The antler tine stood on a shelf in the shed next to Uncle Ray's wrench set. The red channel marker road clipped to the inside band of my work cap, not hidden in my pocket. The berry-stained helmet remained untouched on the high shelf at home, and when Caleb asked why I hadn't cleaned it, I told him, "Some marks are proof of care." He accepted that without teasing me. In December, after a training day that ran long, he met me at the parcel with a grocery bag and that same cast-iron pan. Snow was starting, fine and dry, and we cooked by lantern light, with bristle curled between us. Caleb handed me a plate and said, "You know, you listen all the way now." I looked at him across the stove flame. I had to relearn it. He shrugged like it was obvious. "Keep practicing." I did. I still do. What changed wasn't that grief vanished. Eli's name still catches in my throat some days, especially when wind shifts fast on a slope and I hear young firefighters trying to sound older than they are. What changed was the framework I carried that grief inside. I stopped confusing punishment with loyalty. I stopped treating numbness like duty. A vast, watchful neighbour in the timber showed me a form of service I had neglected. Quiet help, clean boundaries, no need for credit. By late winter, Bristle's muzzle had gone nearly all white, and he slept more than he worked, but he still perked up at the word creek like it was a promise. We made that drive often. Sometimes we left a polished stone on the stump. Sometimes we left nothing and just stood there in the cold, listening to water under ice and chickadees returning to the alder. The broad hush from early fall had broken into ordinary forest sound again, and I took that as its own kind of blessing. I never got a final grand sign, and I'm glad for that. The gift was not spectacle. The gift was being met at my lowest capacity by a presence strong enough to be gentle. That steadied me back into my own life. If you came by my house now, you'd see that dented yellow helmet on a shelf in the mudroom, berry stains still dark along the inner webbing. You'd see a teenage boy's muddy trail shoes by the door and a retired fire dog's bed by the heater. You'd hear me and Caleb arguing over pancake ratios before dawn on Saturdays. You'd hear me tell rookie firefighters that precision keeps people alive and kindness keeps them human. And if you asked me what defeated the burnout quiet, I'd give you the plain answer: not force, not forgetting. Witnessed gentleness repeated until I believed I could carry it forward.